welcome back for another flipped video. Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. World War II had left an enormous destruction around the world, and it was mainly dominated by two nations, the United States and the Soviet Union. But in the years to come, there would be a bitter rivalry between the two that would affect not only just Europe and North America, but the whole world. The essential questions that we're going to be focusing on in this video are: how did agreements made at the Yalta Conference increase tensions between the United States and Soviet Union and lead to the Cold War? And then why was the Cold War considered cold? Golden Hawk historians will explain and analyze the various Cold War conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union and evaluate the extent to which the Cold War was truly cold. While you're watching, make sure that you're taking good notes in either Cornell or outline format as we've talked about in class. It's okay if you need to pause or rewind the video to make sure that you understand all the information and that you're taking good notes. When World War II was over, Germany and mostly all of Europe was in ruins. Farms were destroyed, businesses were destroyed, cities were completely annihilated. The Allies needed to establish a system to govern Germany and rebuild the nation, because at the Potsdam Conference, the Allied powers, French, the Great Britain, and the Americans, had agreed to divide Germany and the capital of Berlin into 4 zones that were to be controlled by Great Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. It was also agreed that the Soviet Union would take over the Eastern European countries and help them to establish democracies. And they also agreed to a plan for Germany to pay back the reparations for the destruction caused by the war so that they didn't have a repeat of the economic crisis following World War I. The Soviet Union had been invaded by Germany during both world wars, and Soviet leaders really believed that they needed a buffer zone of friendly governments in Eastern Europe, those Eastern European countries that they agreed to take over, to guard against another such attack. The American and British leaders believed that Stalin was planning to establish pro-Soviet communist governments instead of democracies in those Eastern European places, and then look to other places beyond just Europe. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union continued to worsen, and this conflict became known as the Cold War. The Cold War was a struggle for power and control between two nations with very different forms of government, economic systems, and ways of life. It essentially was a conflict between communism and capitalist democracy. With the backing of Soviet troops, pro-Soviet communist governments were established throughout Eastern Europe in an area that became known as the Eastern Bloc. The Eastern Bloc included nations like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, the Ukraine, and a bunch of other smaller nations that had been taken over by the Soviet Union. As communism began to spread, tensions between the Soviet Union and those Western democracies continued to grow. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, gave a speech in the United States in which he used the image of the Iron Curtain to describe the sharp division between the Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and the Western democracies. In the picture on the right, you can kind of see that white line that is drawn. That's the Iron Curtain. That was where the divisions were drawn between Soviet areas and the Western democracies. In early 1947, Soviet-backed communists were threatening the governments of Greece and Turkey. President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, which pledged that the United States would provide economic and military aid to oppose the spread of communism. Truman and other Democratic leaders were concerned that if economic or political conditions in Europe worsened, that other countries would also turn to communism for help. The United States launched the Marshall Plan that was designed to provide $13.3 billion to rebuild Europe. The idea was that if Europe could make a rapid recovery from the war, then they would be able to preserve political stability and avoid the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan demonstrated the United States policy of containment, which involved resisting communist aggression in order to contain the spread of communism or to keep it where it already is. The division of Germany and Berlin was originally supposed to be temporary, but due to the tensions between the Soviet Union and the democratic West, the Western leaders began planning for the creation of an independent democratic German nation and West Berlin. The Soviets responded by blocking all land, rail, and water routes into West Berlin, became known as the Berlin Blockade. This left the citizens without any food, coal, or other supplies. So the Western leaders figured out a way to get the supplies so that those citizens in Berlin wouldn't starve. They organized the Berlin Airlift, which was a massive effort to supply West Berlin by air. The Soviets called off the blockade in Berlin after just 2 years. After the Berlin Airlift, Germany was divided into two nations. The Federal Republic of Germany, which was West Germany controlled by the Western democracies, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union. The United States, Canada, and other Western European nations joined together in a military alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. The Soviet Union and other communist nations in Eastern Europe formed their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. After Japan's surrender in World War II, the Allies had gained control of the Korean peninsula. The Soviet Union and the United States agreed to temporarily divide the country in half. The Soviets established a communist government in North Korea, and the United States supported a non-communist regime in the South. In June of 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea with the goal of uniting the country under a communist government. The United States feared that in South Korea that these attempts might lead to other attempts at communist expansion elsewhere in Asia. The United States asked the United Nations to approve the use of force to stop the invasion and help to form a military force from 17 nations to stop the invasion. But most of these soldiers were American. But technically, America didn't declare war, the United Nations did. The North Koreans nearly conquered the South within a matter of months, but due to the UN task force led by MacArthur, they invaded behind enemy lines at Incheon, a small area behind the Soviet line, and were able to push the North Koreans out of South Korea. They were so successful that they were able to push them all the way back to the Chinese border before the North Koreans were aided by the communist Chinese government and were able to push the UN forces back. They ended up in a stalemate right at the 38th parallel in 1953, and then both sides decided to agree to an armistice and agreed to boundaries at the 38th parallel, the approximate location of where the boundaries were before the war. North Korea remained communist, and South Korea remains an ally of the West, even today. During the 1950s and 60s, the nuclear war seemed to draw ever closer as the Soviet Union and the United States raced to develop new powerful weapons. The United States was deeply concerned about the Soviet testing of atomic bombs and began to experiment with creating even more powerful weapons. What they came up with was the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb was created by fusing atoms together and was much more destructive than the original atomic bomb. But less than a year later, the Soviet Union also had the hydrogen bomb. This led to the United States and the Soviet Union stockpiling nuclear weapons in an attempt to intimidate the opposing power. This now locked them in an arms race, or a struggle between nations to gain an advantage in weaponry. The United States had more weapons than the Soviet Union, but it was clear that no matter who had the most weapons, a nuclear attack by either side would end in horrendous destruction. In 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched the first satellite, Sputnik. With the launch of Sputnik, the United States now feared that the Soviets had the advantage. And so in response, they launched the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA, to return the United States to technological greatness. Their goal was to put a man on the moon by 1969. The growing threat of nuclear war had a significant impact on people. People built bomb shelters, American schools led air raid drills, and prepared everybody for a possible attack. The Cold War led to the Red Scare in the United States because many Americans became fearful of the communist influence in the U.S. government and abroad. At the end of World War II, France sought to reestablish its colonial control over Southeast Asia, but in Vietnam, communist rebels called the Viet Minh fought back, forcing the French to give up control of Vietnam. The leader of the Viet Minh was Ho Chi Minh, a communist who was receiving assistance from the Soviet Union and Communist China. His hope was to set up a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Ho Chi Minh's goal was not the spread of communism, however, but independence. Vietnam was temporarily divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam, much like Korea, and the American government was worried about the spread of communism in Vietnam and tried to support the anti-communist government in the South. The United States, especially President Eisenhower, worried that if Vietnam fell to communism, other nations would quickly follow, and this became known as the domino theory, as established in the picture up in the top right-hand corner. The United States sent military aid in order to prevent South Vietnam from being taken over by the North. At first, this was just military advisors that were there to advise the government on what they could do, and then eventually it led to American troops being sent over in droves. The Northern rebels formed a group called the Viet Cong that shared the common goal of overthrowing the government in South Vietnam and reuniting Vietnam as a whole. As the Viet Cong influence spread, the United States increased its aid to the South Vietnamese. President Johnson informed Congress that there was U.S. Navy ships that had been victims of an unprovoked attack in the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnamese gunboats. So U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that gave Johnson the power to expand U.S. involvement without a formal declaration of war. It's important to note that within the Vietnam War, the United States never formally declared war there, hence Cold War. The American troop presence grew very quickly, eventually leading to a draft. The Viet Cong led an offensive against the United States on the Vietnamese New Year called Tet, therefore becoming known as the Tet Offensive. American leaders up to this point had pretty much claimed that a victory was super close, but the Tet Offensive showed that this was not the case. The Viet Cong were being fed supplies and troops along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The United States was able to reach a peace agreement with North Vietnam in 1973, and they started to begin to withdraw their military support. Vietnam was officially reunited in 1976, but the North had abandoned the Soviet-style planned economy and opted for economic reforms instead. But today, Vietnam remains a communist nation. After the Communist East Germany and Democratic West Germany formed, tens of thousands of East Germans left their country by crossing from East Berlin into West Berlin. To stop the exodus of people, East Berlin started to erect the heavily guarded barrier called the Berlin Wall between the two halves of the cities. In 1959, rebels under the leadership of Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's dictator and installed a communist government. Once in power, Castro formed close ties with the Soviet Union, which worried the United States. The United States sought to overthrow Castro by leading the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, but the invasion was quickly a failure and they were defeated. However, in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union entered into a confrontation over the installation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. It was only solved after 2 weeks when the Soviet leaders agreed to remove missiles only if the United States agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey and not attack Cuba again. While relations between the East and West were largely hostile, some attempts at cooperation were made, especially trying to limit the amount of nuclear weapons and avoid nuclear war. President Eisenhower proposed the Open Skies Treaty that would allow each side to fly over to gather accurate information, but the Soviet leaders didn't like that. In 1968, President Nixon sought a policy that he called détente, or reducing tension between the superpowers. That effort resulted in the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or the SALT Treaty, that limited the number of nuclear weapons held by each power and prevented the development of weapons designed to shoot down nuclear missiles. The SALT II agreement resulted in increased arms control as well. Under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, they entered into talks that called for a reduction in nuclear weapons and the elimination of certain types of missiles. Following Joseph Stalin's death, the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev loosened some of Stalin's economic and political restrictions, but continued to limit the individual freedoms. Those changes laid to the hope that the Soviets might loosen their control over the Eastern Bloc, but the Soviet leaders made it clear that that wouldn't happen. But they had to start putting down revolts in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The Soviet economy had begun to falter, and the government planners had been setting goals without consulting the wants and needs of the marketplace. Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Soviet leader in the 1980s, proposed two main ideas, glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost openly discussed the Soviet Union's problem, while perestroika restructured and reformed the Soviet economic system. Under these two plans, it began to introduce more free market ideas. The Soviet Union could no longer uphold the communist governments in Eastern Europe and began to pull Soviet troops out of the Eastern Bloc. Those cities didn't wait for reform, and in 1989, revolution spread across the Eastern Bloc and began to overthrow the communist governments there. When Hungary opened its borders, East Germans traveled to Hungary by tens of thousands, which led to the ability to tear down the Berlin Wall. Less than a year later, the East Germany and West Germany were reunited. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet-backed regimes in Eastern Europe, other smaller nations in the Eastern Bloc started to announce their desire for independence, crumbling the power of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union blamed Gorbachev and tried to oust him with a coup d'etat, but the effort failed. Even though the coup failed, Gorbachev's power was gone, and the Soviet Union had ceased to function. Now that we're done, read back over your notes and make sure you have all the necessary vocabulary. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you in class.